Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Gothic American literature. Um, for today, I'm just going to talk about the second story that we have discussed recently, the artificial N-word, um, because it's a little trickier, and also because the river relates to some of the stories that we're going to read. Well, primarily Revelation. In the coming days. So I'm going to focus on this one. There's a lot to unpack here, and I've already had one phone conversation with somebody about it, which was great. I mean, it doesn't have to be anonymous. Thank you, Ariana, for the great conversation. And it made me make sure to pay attention to a certain part that I'll discuss a little later that is absolutely crucial. But there's a lot going on. At the heart of the story, well, no, I should say on one level, first of all, just so you know, this is my shed. This is the my workspace, and the sun happens to be setting. I have the curtains drawn, but they're very thin, so I'll be squinting and etc. So first of all, on one level, this is a story about the country versus the city, which is a quintessential, age-old conflict. And it's one that actually those of us who are native to Oregon might not as easily recognize. I know a number of us come from different places, and maybe there's other places too where it's not as normal, but you go to a lot of places and this dichotomy is so stark, and it is stark in Oregon, but it's not on the surface of our discourse. But because it is so normal for so many places, in a lot of ways, that isn't primarily what Flannery's talking about. She uses that structure to talk about something else. Now, obviously, given the title of the story, I'm sure we're leery getting into it and thinking, okay, what am I going to read, and to what degree does Flannery, maybe unconsciously we think, to what degree does she toe the line of our modern conceptions of what constitutes racism or whatever? And thankfully, because she isn't alive now and breathing our air, she, I think, gives us actually some very deep insight into the true nature of relations between people. And I hope you saw quite quickly, as I noticed that in basically all the forums you did, that despite her use of the word, well, no, I should say, despite her character's use of the word, Flannery is actually telling a very deeply anti-racist story. But it's not only that, which is fascinating. So the first thing that many of you noticed, but it bears looking at, page 212 is the first time, African Americans are brought up. And throughout, I go back, well, I don't go back and forth. I might have debated this years ago, but even for me reading it, I'll just say N-word in place of it, because, and actually I'll take a pause here for a second to explain that. I think there's valid arguments on both sides, not for actually using it, but for reading faithfully something that was written that uses it. For example, if I was Leonardo DiCaprio in a movie, not that I would be, but if I were having to read racist lines, I would feel it would actually be more honorable to do so, accurately, to portray what's gone on in our country, than to say, well, I can't read that. I mean, art does a number of things, but in this case, maybe I just feel uncomfortable even at this point reading it. And I think it absolutely needs to be in the story, but at this point in my life, I'm not comfortable reading it out loud. At any rate, so I'll be using just the N-word, which of course is very clear anyway. But anyway, so this discourse begins here on 212. You may not like it a bit, Mr. Head continued. It'll be full of N-words. The boy made a face as if he could handle an N-word. All right, Mr. Head said. You ain't never seen an N-word. You wasn't up very early, Nelson said. And I love the subtext there. He's trying to put it back on the, I am ahead of you because I got up early and cooked breakfast. The values are very much not city values, sleeping on the train and that kind of thing, but I started the bacon, whatever. All right, Mr. Head said. You ain't never seen an N-word. You wasn't up very early, Nelson said. You ain't ever seen an N-word, Mr. Head repeated. There hasn't been an N-word in this county since we run that one out 12 years ago. That was before you were born. We'll come back to that actually in a second. That's a throwaway line, or like an easily ignored line that's crucial to what's going on. At any rate, it begins then, and the boy's just like, whatever. He doesn't know what the N-word refers to. We come to learn. He just thinks it's, well, something different than what it is. So here we go. Well, then on 213, he says, Mr. Head says, if you seen one, you didn't know what it was, Mr. Head said, because Nelson was a baby born in Atlanta. And he says, completely exasperated. A 6-month-old child don't know an N-word from anybody else, which already, that's dramatic irony, namely that the audience is like, well, yeah, a 6-month child doesn't know the difference. Therefore, is there a difference other than the sort of artificial concept that you've put on society? And then the boy says, I reckon I'll know an N-word if I see one, the boy said, and got up and straightened his slick, sharply creased gray hat and went outside to the bathroom, the privy. He says, I reckon I'll know one if I see one, because if they're this, negative thing that I've heard about, and then they are, quote, black, unquote, I don't think I'll miss it if one passes in front of me. Okay, so it starts there. And then this is just so beautiful, actually, when the African Americans pass them on the train, and they're noticeable to the boy because they're dressed really nicely. The one that's using a cane, he's large, he's an old, quote, a fat man, and he has a ring with a jewel on it. These are all notable, but his skin color being darker than theirs, more tan, frankly, than theirs, which is the case, of course, with race. It's the same melanin, just more of it or less of it. At any rate, that's not what's noticeable. And so he says, Mr. Head says, what was that? He asked. And I love this. It's so beautiful, spoken in the words of, this hopelessly, no, maybe not hopelessly, but this racist man and this boy that's being indoctrinated by him. What was that? He asked. A man, the boy said, and gave him an indignant look as if he were tired of having his intelligence insulted. The sun just set behind our house. And that's the profound beginning of the answer. A man. What kind of a man? Mr. Head persisted, his voice expressionless. A fat man, Nelson said. He was beginning to feel that he had better be cautious. You don't know what kind, Mr. Head said in a final tone. An old man, the boy said, and had a sudden foreboding that he was not going to enjoy the day. That was an N-word, Mr. Head said and sat back. So as many of you notice, this isn't a natural thing. And I love, honestly, that Flannery just describes them as a coffee color. It's a neutral expression. It's not taking an abstract concept of black and white, which no humans are either of those things. Even if one is very, very white, very, very light, or even albino, they're not white. Or, of course, even very dark African descendants are not black, right? At any rate, she describes them, these ones as coffee colored, and then describes their clothing, and it's sounds luxuriant and full of color, golden and red, whatever. The point is, from a child's point of view, that's what these human beings are. But it continues on. Couple high points I want to hit. First of all, the very beautiful, and there's so much. Almost every paragraph, there's things that I noted and would want to get at, but these stories are too dense, and we don't have the back and forth or an hour and 15 minutes to begin to try to get at it. That's okay. They get to the city. They're walking through it. Lots of things to see. One of the things to note is that these country people who have, not because they're from the country, but as we learned, have intentionally cut themselves off from the world. When they get to the city, they're overwhelmed with the sights and the sounds, and they're trying to measure it in country terms. And I use country and city somewhat loosely, but the grandfather, Mr. Head, is trying to keep the concrete dome in sight at all times, because if you're in the forest or the woods, that's what you do. You have a line of sight waypoint or point of reference that then you navigate by. But that doesn't work in the city, which is an artificial place, comprised of abstractly conceived blocks, 1/10 of a mile, 1/10 of a mile, right angles. These things aren't naturally occurring features of the landscape. They're things that are imposed by human beings. At any rate, so what's interesting is that, and to keep an eye out for this, I think you've already probably noticed it, and I've taken an aside here. Keep an eye out for this. Flannery is not, and this is what makes her brilliant. She is not at all unilaterally critical of any one group. She, as I've said before, is committed to the truth, and that's found in the values of these country people, even these. It's subtle, but the fact that they are trying to take in the city on a human scale, using natural landmarks and these kind of things, is, in Flannery's mind, would be a stance toward the Christian Catholic idea of the world being not human-centered in the way that could sound, but that there is some unique profundity to being human, being made in the image of God. And you can take that, depending on your background, if you would like, more or less metaphorically. But the fact that in her worldview, God became a human being, one time, literally, actually, means that there's something profound and sacred about humanity, and thus something that moves away from the human person, namely towards an abstract idea, creating cities that are more and more efficient and building up, that's getting away from humanity in some sense, and therefore away from the natural order and away from God. At any rate, Flannery isn't a unilateral critic of country people. She lived, as I mentioned before, way out in the country outside of Atlanta. But she's an equal opportunity critic. She doesn't close her eyes at any moment to the foibles of humans. Okay, so they go in there. One of the things that sets up the conclusion is that Mr. Head and Nelson become, for a short moment and in a small way, N-words. Namely, they become the ostracized other walking amongst the normal, which is the African Americans in the African American parts of town. Nelson's skin began to prickle, and they stepped along at a faster pace in order to leave the neighborhood as soon as possible. Oh, and by the way, the word colored, quote unquote, obviously is inappropriate to use now to describe people of color. But just as a historical note, even as recently as about 2010, the NAACP, National Association, I might have the number of letters mixed up, even says colored people in its name, and even put out a statement, no, that's not, it might be archaic, but it's not offensive. It is offensive now, and so I certainly wouldn't use it. But what I'm getting at is that Flannery she steps very carefully to never use any offensive language about African Americans in the story for the time period. And I don't mean because she was ignorant, I mean because language changes. And so for her at the time, a colored neighborhood is actually the most polite way to say African American. At any rate, so that's just a side note. So Nelson and Mr. Head, walking through this neighborhood, I mean, they feel so uncomfortable. They're lost, and they're just like at their wits' end. They are what they become what they try to put African Americans into, a label and an ostracized other. But even then, when Nelson runs up to the larger African American woman, this sort of matriarchal figure, he stares at her with a longing of love. It feels very much like a longing for a mother, and it's undifferentiated for him, and perhaps heightened by the fact that she's an African American woman. And it's just another, and it's such a pure sort of like longing for motherly love from this child that it's another stab through the fabric of ingrained racism that he's surrounded with. But at any rate, they finally escape into, a white neighborhood. And this is where it gets interesting. Well, I mean, the kind of conclusion begins here. First of all, they have this rift where, and it seems the purpose of this rift between Mr. Head and Nelson, when he's like, it's not my kid, serves to set up Mr. Head for grace. He finally is like, I'm the worst. And, that's the precursor to any true change in life, any true repentance. And they move on to the white neighborhood. And this is fascinating. I don't know exactly what to do with this one part here. I mean, I guess I should say, keep an eye out for details that could be there or wouldn't have to be there, but are there, or vice versa. Because as we've talked about in class, anytime it's like, well, this is clearly a choice by the author, some detail. Well, there's probably meaning there. For example, when they're walking into this white neighborhood, which of course there's no people, the houses it's not just white, of course, it's wealthy and suburban. The houses are set far back from the street. A loud bark jarred him to attention, and he looked up to see a fat man approaching with 2 bulldogs. He waved both arms like someone shipwrecked on a desert island. I'm lost, he called. I'm lost, and I can't find my way, and me and this boy have got to catch this train, and I can't find the station. Oh, God, I'm lost. Oh, help me, God, I'm lost. Real quick, to give a description of the man to show you, why I think this is pertinent. The man, who was bald-headed and had on golf knickers, asked him what train he's trying to catch. So picture this. There's a bald-headed man with golf knickers. Is there any picture that would more look like what? A bulldog? So there's 3, it's kind of like a 3-headed dog. It's it's almost like a specter from the underworld. Like they're going on this journey and they've finally hit rock bottom and it's actually interesting. I'm just thinking of this now. At the beginning, Flannery brings up Virgil, who's a guide to Dante, and she brings up a lesser known one, who take their, okay, this is far afield, but if you've read Dante's Inferno or you're familiar with it, this is a trope that continues throughout a lot of literature. Virgil shows up, this wiser mentor in this sort of quasi-death, and takes Dante on this journey through hell, purgatory, and up to heaven. They go through this journey through death, at any rate, and a 3-headed dog, mythical creature, it's almost as if he's at the midpoint of his journey through the underworld. And it's at this point where he, instead of keeping up, he's trying to prove to this boy, you need to follow me.
You don't know about the city, but it's at this point that he's lost everything and is completely vulnerable, which is the only time we're open to change and repentance, aren't we? But and he says, I'm lost. Oh God, I'm lost. Oh, help me, God, I'm lost. Okay, so they get the directions and they start off towards town. It is interesting that he still doesn't trust his ability. Somebody mentioned he's cheap. Well, I mean, they put in money to the scales, and the streetcar wouldn't be much more money. I think he's never taken a streetcar. He doesn't want to look stupid in front of the boy again. And at least he knows if I walk and follow the tracks, I'm on my own 2 feet. It's this direction. The tracks aren't going to go somewhere else. This is a thing I can trust. And it's something, again, human scaled. And it's like walking through the woods. There's the path. I'm going to follow it, not hop onto this mechanical device and trust it to take me where I'm going. But I'll leave that aside. There's some potential interpretations there. But the end. Okay. It could be pretty darn confusing. Here we go. Pages, 229, bottom of 229, and then the end, 230, 231. They come upon this figurine in a yard. And those of you not from the South, which is basically everybody, or who haven't lived in the South, and I'm looking at you, Bailey. I don't know if, I forget what part of Texas you're from, but I know that where I was in Texas for 7 years, plus I was born there. I was born there, as Nelson says, so I have every right to go there. Anyway, people did this. I mean, it wasn't these figurines that finally at this point would be completely unacceptable, but people had these, different figurines in the yard for different reasons. And be that as it may, you might not be familiar with it, but it's described in a very odd way if you're not familiar with it, but it would be recognizable, that's what I'm saying. This is a caricaturized picture of an African American. Let's see here. He is holding, of course, stereotypically and incredibly racistly, a watermelon. But even in, I saw African American figurines in people's homes, like holding a tray that, drinks could be put on and that kind of thing. I bartended for a number of years in very rich people's houses while we were in Waco. At any rate, but this is what suddenly brings together Old Man Head and Nelson. Why would it bring them together? And it's not just like, oh, we made up because well, look at this weird thing, and it's much stronger than that, because Flannery describes them like, they both had their hands in their pockets the exact same way. So I'm going to read some of this here. Mr. Head stood looking at him silently until Nelson stopped at a little distance. Then, as the two of them stood there, Mr. Head breathed, "An artificial N-word." It was not possible to tell if the artificial, and again, Negro, like a colored person, was a polite way to say African American then. So that's what Flannery's trying to do here. It was not possible to tell if the artificial Negro were meant to be young or old. That's another key thing. It's connecting it to Nelson and Mr. Head, who are both described often as like an old young man or young old man. It's not possible to tell if the artificial Negro were meant to be young or old. He looked too miserable to be either. Miserable, keep in mind the word agony at the end. He was meant to look happy because his mouth was stretched up at the corners, but the chipped eye and the angle he was cocked at gave him a wild look of misery instead. An artificial N-word, Nelson repeated in Mr. Head's exact tone. So again, she's trying to show, look, they're coming together, right? The two of them, and that's the only, again, she said the two of them, that's the second time after like describing them following at a distance for quite a while. The two of them stood there with their necks forward at almost the same angle again, and their shoulders curved in almost exactly the same way, and their hands trembling identically in their pockets. Mr. Head looked like an ancient child, and Nelson looked like a miniature old man. He stood gazing at the artificial Negro as if they were faced with some great mystery, which they are. Some monument to another's victory that brought them together in their common defeat. They could both feel it dissolving their differences like an action of mercy. Mr. Head had never known before what mercy felt like, because he had been too good to deserve any. But he felt he knew now. He looked at Nelson and understood that he must say something to the child to show that he was still wise, and in the look the boy returned, he saw a hungry need for that assurance. Nelson's eyes seemed to implore him to explain once and for all the mystery of existence. Mr. Head opened his lips to make a lofty statement and heard himself say, "They ain't got enough real ones here. They got to have an artificial one." After a second, the boy nodded with a strange shivering about his mouth and said, "Let's go home before we get ourselves lost again." Okay, so before I talk about, and Ariana raised the question, like, what is the figurine? Why is it's so central to the climax, clearly? Man, I've wrestled with this in my head a little bit. There is clearly the truth. Okay, I think there's lots of things that are happening simultaneously and contradictorily if viewed too literally. Because I think that the redemption that we sense in the last page is true, and the mercy and the grace. Okay, it's not all that's going on. So before we look at the figurine and how it brings them together and why it's a climax, did you notice, so take it back a second, did you notice throughout the moon? Yeah, the moon. Sorry to stare at you. Quarantine. It's gone on too long. No, but really, the moon. It starts at the very beginning. You put your little page ribbon there. Go back to the beginning of your story if you're reading along or even watching this. I'll take whatever I can get. And that's how the story starts, is with the moon, right? Mr. Head awakened, discovered the room was full of moonlight. Okay, but what does that moonlight do? Strong. When he's in his own home, secure there, what does that moonlight do? Well, it casts everything in a, quote, dignifying light. And the moon, in the reflection in the mirror, which is, again, I'm seeing things as I say, is a double moon, right? Because a moon is a reflection, keep that in mind, asks permission almost to enter the room. He's in charge here. And the moonlight is strong, right? It rolled forward and cast a dignifying light on everything. The straight chair against the wall it's just a chair, right? Looked stiff and attentive, as if it were awaiting an order. And Mr. Head's trousers, hanging to the back of it, had an almost noble air, like the garment some great man had just flung to his servant. But the face on the moon was a grave one. Okay. The brief thing I want to say there is, trousers cast over the back of a chair are about as undignified looking as it gets. But of course, in the light of this obsequious moon, they gain dignity. It's all in the contrast. And going forward, the moon is mentioned throughout. That's on 210. 213, when they're waiting for the train, and he's like, "Oh man, I hope the train stops," right? Mr. Head had to make special arrangements with the ticket agent to have this train stop, and he was secretly afraid it would not, in which case he knew Nelson would say, "I never thought no train was going to stop for you." Listen, under the useless morning moon, the tracks looked white and fragile. Of course, white and fragile. A little bit earlier, why is this useless morning moon? Well, once the sun's rising, the moon it's there, you can see it, but it's not lighting anything up, right? Just a little earlier on that page in that paragraph. Of course, looking orange-colored sun coming up behind the east range of mountains was making the sky a dull red behind them. But in front of them, it was still gray, and they faced a gray, transparent moon, hardly stronger than a thumbprint, and completely without light. When he's in his room and it's in the middle of the night, when they're back home, the moonlight floods everything and colors everything and gives it an artificial dignity. Now the moon's useless, and it kind of is juxtaposed with his own feeling of inadequacy and insecurity, right? At the end, after that scene where, they're faced as if with some great mystery, looking at this suffering African American figurine when he says, "Well, they ain't got enough real ones here. They got to have an artificial one." The boy says, "Let's go home." Their train glided into the suburb stop where they just are catching it there in town, just as they reached the station, and they boarded it together. And 10 minutes before it was due to arrive at the junction, back out way outside of town where they live, 10 minutes before it's due to arrive at the junction, they went to the door and stood ready to jump off it if it didn't stop. But it did, just as the moon, restored to its full splendor, sprang from a cloud and flooded the clearing with light. As they stepped off, the sage grass was shivering gently in shades of silver, just like the floorboards were in the first page. And the clinkers under their feet glittered with a fresh black light. The treetops, fencing the junction like the protecting walls of a garden, were darker than the sky, which was hung with gigantic white clouds illuminated like lanterns. I'm going to read the next sentence because this is what makes it not so simple. Mr. Head stood very still and felt the action of mercy touch him again. But this time he knew that there were no words in the world that can name it. He understood that it grew out of agony, which is not denied to any man, and which is given in strange ways to children. Okay, what on earth? Remember when we read the first Toni Morrison introduction essay at the beginning of this course? She talked about how the whiteness, which doesn't just mean skin color, but came to be basically that the whiteness of this new world needed the contrast of some other by which to say that, we're here because they're there. It's the old world. It's the fears of the old world and various things like that. But then increasingly with the slave labor that was brought over and now lived amongst them, it became the enslaved, chained black bodies that became that contrast. That's what we see here. It's very clear the symbolism of the moon is something like that. The town that they come from, the county, is 100% white. I don't know if that's historical in Georgia, but as of 12 years ago, they've run off the last African American. So in that place, they can, have the full surety of their own reflected whiteness. Basically, not those people over there, where are these people? And I say that it's not just skin tone, because in other Flannery stories, in fact, in Revelation, we'll see that very clearly. Same with Good Country People. But in Revelation, we'll see it very clearly. It's not just skin tone. There's a whole gradation. Well, I'm better than these people in these ways. But anyway, they're able to, the moonlight is fully strong, right? In his own bedroom, in their own town, where they don't have to go and face the complexity of the world and the contradictions that come about when they actually meet a, quote, inward. And so what's interesting, in the town even, it's kind of a microcosm, because in the country they're able to do that. Well, the suburbs with these houses spaced far away from the street, certainly no African Americans there at this time. The grandfather, Mr. Head, accurately and prophetically says, they ain't got enough real ones here. They've got to have an artificial one. Meaning, it's inherently contradictory. We want to get rid of these people that we view as not, they can't live with us. They're sectioned off in the train. They can't be in our neighborhood. But we can't be who we are unless we know that we're better than them. And so, we'll make an artificial one and stick it in our yard. That's clear that that's what's going on. And Mr. Head and Nelson are united in finally their rejection of this world where they have to come face to face with the real African Americans, because they don't live up to the abstract conception that they have of them that's necessary for them to be who they are, in contrast. And this is where, Flannery is so great and complex in her dealing with people, because like when probably most of us, when we read them getting on the train and stuff, just the fact that they're talking, let alone talking loudly, just like, those are the kind of people I'm just like, you know, in my own judgmental people watching, right? And so is Flannery. I mean, she's like poking at them, but then they're, clearly needing to view themselves in a certain way, and they have to maintain their completely outlandish abstract view of what African Americans are, because clearly on the train, I mean, these people are almost, they almost sound like royalty walking by. They don't even notice these Nelson and Mr. Head sitting there. So they go back home. But what makes this story a great work of art, I would say, it would be already almost, I would say, before the last couple paragraphs after that, because that right there is just the way that she incarnates this message of the absurdity, the illogicality of racism as it's passed down generation to generation. That's trumped by somehow the fact that she shows even Mr. Head, this grandfather, receiving mercy at the end, because he does. I don't want to deny that. Now, maybe there's a question like, to what degree is the ending ironic? I do think it's ironic. Namely, that we see how like they're getting mercy, namely their reunification and the grandfather's growth to realize, you know what? I'm capable of sin. I denied, my own grandson that I love and I'm trying to bring up. He does receive mercy. But what's crazy about what Flannery does here is a few things. She doesn't stop where we naturally stop. We'll see this for sure in Revelation. She doesn't give mercy to the people that like, oh, this person was bad and then they change. She gives people mercy. She shows it being given, grace, to people that not only are bad and maybe change, but are still people that we wouldn't like or think have such huge blind spots of sin, really. Like he's still going to be racist. And for us, we'd be like, well, then clearly he didn't change. But what's profound about Flannery is her ability to show like the perspective that like we're all like, this Mr. Head changing that little bit is actually a profound act of grace. And, if you want to think about it theologically, an act of salvation. He doesn't have to somehow step outside his time, his history, and his personal limitations to be perfect, in this life. How many of us even change as much as he did when he's confronted with his own ability to deny his grandson? That's a lot of it. But it's also this, the other valence of the interpretation is that it is still ironic. At the very end, Nelson, composing his expression under the shadow of his hat brim, watched him with a mixture of fatigue and suspicion. He's not sure about all this, but as the train glided past them and disappeared like a frightened serpent into the woods, even his face lightened and he muttered, "I'm glad I've went once, but I'll never go back again." That's the end of the story. So it's like the train is, it's called a serpent and goes slithering back into the woods at the end there. Clearly, this is a temptation out of which comes grace. The serpent, of course, like referring to the prototypical serpent in the garden motif. And so what Flannery's doing here is, I think it's approaches what real grace is like, because I think it's totally real. Just like maybe you might think, well, my grandparents, who knows? I don't think my grandparents were all wonderful. But you might think, oh, well, they're backwards in this way. This one is, or my parents. And Flannery's human depth in her writing allows her to go beyond the easy, shallow, well, this person's racist, they're the bad guy, to like, this is a story about the redemption of this grandfather who doesn't ever really understand his own racism, but does receive grace and redemption and a true change in a true way in an unexpected way. And the final thing that makes it even more like jaw-dropping is that he's given this grace by the suffering of the African American in America. That's made clear here. And he shares in that suffering in a very small way, of course, but he's like united to it. Mr. Head stood, he understood that it grew out of agony, which is not denied to any man. He's gone through a very, very small experience of, as I said, being an N-word in a very small way. Of course, I understand he gets to do it for 1 hour maybe, right? Not a lifetime. Which was out of agony, which is not denied to any man, which is given in strange ways to children. He understood it was all a man could carry into death to give his maker. And he suddenly burned with shame that he had so little of it to take with him. Agony, suffering over one's own sin and suffering in general. That's all one can take. He stood appalled, judging himself with the thoroughness of God, while the action of mercy covered his pride like a flame and consumed it. He never thought himself a great sinner before, but he saw now that his true depravity, he saw now that his true depravity had been hidden from him, lest it cause him despair. He realized that he was forgiven for sins from the beginning of time, when he had conceived in his own heart the sin of Adam, until the present when he had denied poor Nelson. He saw that no sin was too monstrous for him to claim as his own. And since God loved in proportion as he forgave, he felt ready at that instant to enter paradise. Yeah, I'll leave it with that. As we continue talking about Flannery, I don't know if there's a more ruthlessly committed, I mean that ruthlessly committed to love and grace without sentimentality. Yeah, I don't know if there's a person like that more than Flannery. I didn't necessarily give you as much of an introduction to her as I could have last time, and I'll leave it with this. But one thing you should know is she got lupus as a relatively young woman and ended up dying from it, I think at 38 or something, 36, which is why her writing career was cut short. Also, she, as I mentioned, I visited her home, which is now preserved as a museum, and her bedroom, she has this tiny little bed, and then she has her desk set against the backside of a big dresser armoire so that she wouldn't be distracted by anything, and she would basically chain herself to that desk to write. It was 3 hours a day, which she considered not very much, but she was pretty much of ill health and didn't have stamina to do more. And she said something like, genius doesn't, or inspiration doesn't always strike, but I'm going to be here chained to this desk, writing every day for 3 hours so that when it does, I will be here. She considered herself a vessel to be emptied out in service of the gift that had been given to her, and to use it, bringing people to this severe mercy, this ineluctable and frankly frightening grace that is at the heart of truth, life, reality. All right, y'all, sorry if that was a bit long. It's hard to get into something like this quickly. Take care. Hope you're doing well. See you in the forums. Keep up the great work. Man, I didn't mention this at the beginning, but I was blown away again, this time, reading the forums on artificial N-word. Wow. Thank you guys. All right. Talk to you later. Peace out.